Good to see you all this morning. Thanks for coming out. And I knew I would be a bit of an outlier when I accepted the invitation to the conference, as I'm not a historian, and I sensed that this was a historical conference, and much less an Anglican historian, and also not a theologian per se, but I am an Anglican, and I'm one whose path to the faith came through Greek philosophy. And I want to demonstrate to you this morning something of what that looks like, and if there's time, how it might cash out in the public square. I have some thoughts about that if I don't have time, and you'll help me with time, I hope. Then we can think about that in Q&A. Also, I do think my philosophical conversion to Christianity finds a home in the Anglican Church, not only as it stands today, but also in Anglican tradition. There have long been Anglican Platonists, not only in the so-called Cambridge Platonists of the 17th century, who were in effect latitudinarians or broad church Anglicans, but also 20th century figures, too numerous to list, but I will mention C.S. Lewis, and since the Canadian George Grant was mentioned yesterday, I'll also say that George Grant was an Anglican Platonist. My own Greek philosophy origin to Christianity is somewhat different in that it focuses not on Plato's metaphysics, things like the immortality of the soul or the doctrine of the forms, but on his figure Socrates. And what makes Socrates singularly important in the history of philosophy is his knowledge of his ignorance. He knows what he does not know and that he does not know it. He's not ignorant of everything, of course, but he is indeed ignorant of things only a God could know. The things he does not know, others do not know either, though they suppose they do. Socrates notoriously shows them that they do not, and for this he is killed. We also do not know the things that Socrates does not know. And I want to argue that knowledge of our ignorance is vitally important for our Christian faith because it emphasizes its status as a faith and not knowledge. That will require some explaining, but I'll bait you with this insight from the Socratic perspective. Jesus' answer to the not knowing of Socrates is not knowledge, gnosis, but faith, pistis. He asks that we believe, not that we know. Put more starkly, Christ's answer to agnosticism is not Gnosticism, but belief, faith. Let me lay out the steps in the barest form so I can stay within my time constraints if I can. Socrates does not know where we come from, where we go after we die, or in any comprehensive sense, what the source of being is, or the animating first principle of ethics. Two thoughts in particular seem to agitate him and motivate his life. One is that he does not know what makes good things good, and therefore cannot be sure of what is good. Second is that there may be life after death, with judgment, rewards, punishments, for conduct during life. And this very much raises the stakes for him, especially since he cannot be sure of what is ultimately good. I want to illustrate this with you very briefly through the logic of his short dialogue, Plato's short dialogue about Socrates called the Laches, which is about courage. I'll just modernize it for ease of understanding. The problem looks something like this. Courage is a virtue, and virtues are good. Therefore, courage is good. But what now of those terrorists who flew their airplanes into the Twin Towers? Courage is a holding fast to the opinion you have about what you should do, even in the face of fear of death and uncertainty. They exhibited those properties. But what they did was evil. How can a virtue be evil? Put differently, maybe we want to say for courage put to evil uses, we would want to give that another name other than courage, so we don't give a virtue that property. But we would still need to know what it is that makes particular acts that seem courageous good or not good. In other words, we would have to know the good in order to separate out acts of courage from acts of pseudo-courage. Socrates' word for the problem here is aporia, an impasse. Our natural ability to reason about the good results in aporia. More about this in a minute. Socrates thinks that the only rational response to aporia, given the high stakes of the possibility of judgment, is to proceed cautiously in life while continuing to search. The Socratic life is zetetic. He's engaged in zetasis, search. Before I go any further, I want to remind you of the first words of Jesus in John's Gospel. He has a handful of John the Baptist's disciples follow him after he is baptized. He turns around to them and says, "Ti zetete," for what are you searching? Jesus knows himself to be the answer for those who are searching. What is Socrates searching for? He is searching for the ground of being, God, the source of all that is visible and invisible, and the source, or the arche, of all that is good. He is on a divine search for wisdom, and he is painfully aware that without it, human life is a problem. Where can he find divine wisdom? One of the things he does at this point is survey the purported experts, the wise men. You might say he goes to the Catholics and the Calvinists and the Anabaptists and finds them all very showy and impressive and full of knowledge and pride. But when he interviews them carefully, he finds that they do not actually know the things they profess to know. I thought you'd laugh when I did the Catholic Anabaptist thing. I was disappointed. They contradict themselves and reveal that they too are actually in a state of aporia, though they supposed they weren't. Their doctrines turn out to be doxa, opinion, but not episteme, knowledge, or gnosis. And the problem with opinions is that they turn out to be unstable as contexts change or as they are cross-examined with other opinions. What to do? Socrates, in the Republic and other dialogues, names some criteria for the object of his search, that on which all wisdom depends. It must be singular, not plural. He seems to have been a monotheist. The arche cannot be plural, or there would be a unifying arche that holds the plurality together. It must be beyond being. He thought the cause of being cannot be itself being. And our knowledge of it must be comprehensive. It will not do to know it only in part. I would illustrate that just by saying, if you came to know what a hand is, but you didn't know about it in relation to the totality that is a body, your knowledge of the hand would be woefully inadequate. So too with God. Again, the stakes are very high, as Socrates foresees. There can be no end to the faction, and I'm quoting from the Republic, or I'm paraphrasing. There can be no end to the faction and struggle and turmoil in the human soul or in human cities until this is found. Uncertainty, disagreement, and wrong action will be everywhere. Here, Socrates perfectly describes, from the viewpoint of philosophy, that humans are in a state like the fall. And he concludes that we are in desperate need of a certain kind of king, a philosopher king, if you will, where philosopher means not just somebody who is on a search, as Socrates is on a search, but someone who has completed the search, someone who is human but has a comprehensive knowledge of God, or at least God's will for us. Such a one would have to be a God-man. And Socrates is absolutely unambiguous about that. But such a one is impossible. How can a finite being comprehend the infinite? How can a being comprehend the source of being that is itself beyond being? How can a part comprehend the whole? Let me just pause to say, I think the miracle of Christ is much clearer to a Socratic than to many a Christian, because we see the ontological impossibility of it. Here we have Socrates' most thoroughgoing statement about the human condition, your condition. If such a one cannot be found, then the human condition is itself aporia, an impasse, a longing for something we can never achieve, knowledge of the good, and thus destined to be always disordered and conflictual and ignorant and sinful both in city and body. The prayer from Aquinas hit this perfectly. It had both sin and ignorance as the two conditions that from which we need to be saved. Can such a one be found? Put differently, but still in Socrates' language, can we find a soter, a savior king, who might deliver us from this condition? Such a one would seem impossible. But this is not the final position Socrates takes. Rather, he says that over all of time, we cannot rule out the possibility that such a one will arise. And in the meantime, Socrates articulates a myth, which he thinks best captures our needs. He calls it the myth of It is a myth of judgment after death, punishment, cleansing, renewal, and rebirth. And the final line of the Republic is that if we believe, pistis, this myth, it will save us. Now I shift to my notes. I try not to write my talks twice, and there's going to be a book from the proceedings of this conference, and so I didn't really want to overwrite this. Let me shift to Anglicanism and say that the Socratic and the Christian disposition is one of belief and not knowledge. I'm not shifting to Anglicanism, I'm actually making a transition. We still, I think, do not know. But we can, with God's grace, believe. And if we look at our creeds, our foundational documents, they're all about belief. We believe, not knowledge. By the way, the reason I'm stressing this, I think it's going to be very important for the public square. When you enter the public square full of knowledge, that's one thing. When you enter it full of delicate belief, that's another thing entirely. One thing I want to argue is that the Anglican Church has become a good home, not only because it has had Platonists in its tradition, but because through its need to extemporize and compromise, it has dealt with, it has resulted in a kind of openness to pluralism and a less doctrinally laden form of communal worship than the alternatives like the Catholic Church or, say, the Calvinist Church. Its doctrinal minimalism opens a place, I think, for a sort of Socratic approach to Christianity, and I think that's good. It may not be that there's a single theologian you could point to that on theological principle has a sort of Socratic Christianity, but the net result in practice is an openness, I think, to this approach to Christianity. I wonder if I have time to think about politics or if I should sit down.
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
7 minutes.
What does the public square look like for incomplete, imperfect, fallible, finite beings who live by a belief that is not knowledge, and a belief that also does not fundamentally transform the human condition of aporia? Let me say just a quick word about that. Christ can't and doesn't. So I think he can't, but I'm not sure, but he doesn't change us into beings that can comprehensively know the mind of God. And that means the aporia that Socrates describes is not removed, and the problem, the ethical problem, that Socrates faces because he does not know the arche of the good, is not fully removed by Jesus' revelation. Jesus changes us in two ways. He asks us to believe that he is the Son of God. I think he knows that we can't know this, because when he says, "And who do you say I am?" and Peter says, more or less, "I think you're the Son of God," Jesus bursts out, "You can't know that." Remember this? You can't know that. I think he knows that we can't know that, and he doesn't transform us into knowers of that. He also asks that we obey two commandments upon which depend all the law and the prophets. In other words, he gives us an account, not of the totality of God, but of a stand-in arche, a first principle for our ethical life. And that first principle is to love God with all our heart and to love our neighbors as ourselves. Now, that does not completely remove our problems, because we don't know what love requires in specific situations, especially not in conflicting situations where love seems to require opposite things of us. I won't illustrate those situations, but I'm painfully aware that there are situations, think about war, where it's unclear what love requires. Does it require pacifism or defense, for example? So we are not removed from the state of aporia and delivered into clarity. We are rather given a provisional insight into the arche. And I would suggest that approached this way, Anglicanism in the public square, and I know that not all Anglicans approach their faith this way, but if it were approached this way, Anglicanism in the public square would be politically cautious, minimalist, certainly non-eschatological. So, for example, the sort of grand progressive projects that have characterized the 20th century would be inconceivable from the perspective of Socratic Anglicanism, because they pretend to know the end and the means to the end. And that is knowledge that only God could know. And if a Socratic Anglicanism is left with one, I think, very profound insight, it is an unwillingness to pretend to know what only God could know. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Corey, which has really set us off well, I think.